Hello and welcome back. This is Richard Golson. We're going to take a look at task 3, creating an auto scaling group. This is all part of the Architects Module 10 guided lab. Now, at this stage, we already have a load balancer with the target group. We've also prepared in the lab itself, they've prepared an application server for us. And what we're going to do is create the AMI for the auto scaling. So let's go take a look. Here's the application server, and I'm not going to get into the details. You might want to take a look at it. But what I'm going to do with this is create my AMI. So I'll go to my actions and images and templates and create an image. Uh, for this part, let's take a look at that. Let's make sure we give it the appropriate name, web server AMI. There's no real details on this that we have to play around with. Just the name and the image description. We can leave all the rest of it the defaults. We're not going to change the size or anything like that. Um, what's great is that we'll be able to use this image to launch brand spanking new EC2 instances. It'll allow us to clone the instance that is hosting our application, and that makes it available for rapid deployment in our auto scale group. So as the need grows, we can add new instances, or if we're just going steady state and say, hey, I just have a fixed number I need to maintain, this makes it really easy to do that. So now it's creating the AMI. And what I can do at this stage is start creating my auto scale group. By the time I get to the point where I'm ready to use this, the AMI will be ready for me. So in the next part of the task, I'm going to create my launch template, and then I'll create my auto scale group. So for the launch templates, I'm going to click here. Now, a launch template basically allows me to standardize the instances that get launched. This is required for an auto scale group. This is not an option. You have to have a document that states the details of the EC2 instance because there's more than just the AMI. So let's go ahead and create our launch template. And let's take a look here now. For the launch template, we'll go ahead and give it a name, inventory LT. Having problems capturing that. Paste it in, and then we have a description. We can skip that. We're going to use the auto scale guidance, and that'll make it a little easier because without that, we could have some very interesting results down below. So let's make sure we select the guidance for auto scaling. And then I'll need to come to my AMIs. I should see the AMI in there. Okay, great. There it is. Now, once it's displayed, it's now been selected. Okay, so there it is. Just give it a moment and it'll select it. And then the instance type, we're going to do a t2.micro as usual. Be somewhat under provisioned, but again, it's appropriate for a lab. And then let's see if we need a key pair. Those are optional. So we'll go ahead and use the vote key. So the existing key pair vote key. So they created this one for us in the lab. And then let's see what's next. So we have our key pair, right? And then in the network settings, we're going to select that security group, the inventory app security group. Okay, this is one we looked at earlier. So we're not going to assign the subnet at this stage. We're going to do that in an auto scale group. And the reason for doing that is to make it easier. And I'm actually talking when I should finish this. I apologize. This thing just scrolled on me here. Let's get back over here. Scroll to the bottom of this. There's my inventory apps, bottom of my list. Okay, great. Now, by not assigning the subnet it's launching into, this can be launched into any network or subnet. So we'll make those determinations when we create an autoscale group because we have to say where to launch the autoscale group. So we don't want to detail what subnets this should launch into. We're going to do that with the autoscale group. Okay, so we can leave those alone. Now let's see if there's anything else. So we've selected the inventory app, and then when we go into the advanced details, we're going to have a couple settings here, and the first one is instance profile. So let's go down into the advanced details down below. Okay, and that's here. We'll expand this, and it actually opens a fairly large section here. So we need the role, okay, the inventory app role. All right. And then we're directed to select, and this one can be hard to find, right? The detailed CloudWatch monitoring, we do need that. So this is going to allow autoscaling to react quickly to changing utilization because with the detailed monitoring, it's checking it at a much more rapid pace. So we have to go dig that out in here. They kind of hide it in here. So we'll go take a moment and go look for that. And there it is, detailed CloudWatch monitoring. We're going to enable that. Okay. So you can see additional charges apply. So oftentimes what you do is you set that up during testing. And then once you've established what's appropriate and this whole thing's working, we don't need to see that in that much detail anymore. We can actually modify that. All right. So our next step is a very neat feature. Now we're using an AMI. If I was not using an AMI, I could instead, or we're using a custom AMI. Let me rephrase that. If you recall, we created a custom AMI from an EC2 instance that already had a web application installed on it. It was a golden image that we created. What if I just use an off-the-shelf AMI, like an Amazon Linux AMI? I could do that, and then I could put the user data in here, and then at launch, the EC2 instance would deploy, which deploys pretty quickly, under a minute, and then it could go through the configuration, and we would configure the load balancer in the autoscale group to not make that EC2 instance available until the application completed configuration. So that is an option because then we could just use a standard AMI and not carry the cost of using a custom AMI. All right, for this lab, it looks like they want us to do this just to have the practice of setting this up. So unnecessary when you already have a custom AMI, but it's again, this is a lab, so it's a little bit of practice time right in here, right? Go ahead and paste that in. Okay. And then let's see if there's anything else. And we'll go ahead and create the launch template at this stage. So I'll go ahead and click on that. So just confirming we're using our custom AMI. It's a T2.micro. The firewall is the inventory app firewall, which is appropriate for EC2 instances. And we've configured a few other things, including a role and detailed monitoring. And we downloaded the vote key and we included the user data. So go ahead and create our launch template. Give it a moment. And so we can see that it has been completed. It doesn't take much for it to create that. Okay, that's it for this video. When we come back, we will get started on the autoscale group. We'll see you then.